I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Peoples and let her get started right away this evening. And we will have some time to address some of the questions that folks submitted with their registration. And we'll also have some time for live Q&A, hopefully at the very end. So thanks for coming, folks. Off we go.
So imagine right now you're listening to Lizzo, who is crooning and telling us to live our best lives and to be unapologetic and to stand in our power and our strength with Black Alive energy. That's the energy I really want to start this conversation with as I tell you this fascinating story of what we learned when we worked on this report. So we're talking about evaluating curriculum for cultural responsiveness. I want to first introduce myself to folks who may not be as familiar with me. My name is Dr. Leah, and I am a researcher, evaluator, educator, and collaborator, and I absolutely love the work that I do. I am very much mission-driven, meaning almost all of my work is grounded in understanding educational equity and understanding how that plays out in both theory and practice. I currently work at transformative research using high quality research that produces good data that informs educational equity. I'm an affiliate for the Center for Culturally Responsive Evaluation and Assessment. So if you didn't know about CREA, that's also the nickname. There's a lot of information about what culturally responsive evaluation and assessment can look like. There's conferences, there's also a website with materials and resources as well. I have also worked almost a decade with the American Evaluation Association in various leadership roles and positions. But tonight I really want to highlight the multi-ethnic issues and evaluation TIG, where I've served as chair for multiple years. And finally, previously, I also worked as a research director and assistant director of research to practice partnerships and community initiatives at NYU Metro Center. So you'll be hearing a lot about EJ Rock tonight, which is at NYU. And that's because we have a really close relationship because I used to work there. So some of the work I'm going to be talking about was during my time at NYU and then since transitioning. So there's really like 4 things you need to know when thinking about my work that I've kind of mentioned already. 1, that guiding question, how do we get to equity? 2, a focus on using good data. So for me, good data means it's useful, it's equity oriented, it's critical, it's transformative, and liberating data that can help people dream and create educational equity. I use almost across all projects a culture responsive lens and critical approach to the work that I do, whether that's research or evaluation. And I'm often using a collaborative and participatory approach to the work that I do. And that's important because that's actually where this story begins. At my time at NYU, I was part of the Education Justice Research and Organizing Collaborative. I will put a link in the chat, or actually Izzy will put a link in the chat to EJ Rock to see more information about them. And I'm sure Flor will talk more about that during her presentation. But essentially, it connected me with this group called the New York City Coalition for Educational Justice. Now, basically, this is a group of really incredible Black and Brown parent leaders who are talking about and advocating for culture responsive education. And they are also working with youth who are also involved through youth organizing. And so they have been running these campaigns around culture responsive curriculum and having many conversations and discussions as they were listening to schools and the promises that schools were making towards commitments for culture responsive education. And one of the questions that came up was, how will we know it if we see it and can provide some evidence and some data and some thinking around that? So that was the question that they were posing, and they brought that question to this collaborative. So again, the EJ Rock team, which is made up of researchers, organizers, practitioners, education equity advocates, are all part of that collective. So we began to think about that question. How can we use data to really understand if the curriculum proposed, the changes proposed, the policies proposed are actually reflecting culture responsive principles, values, and themes? And to answer this question, we came up with the scorecard, but I want to tell you first how we got there. So we did an initial search of existing tools, rubrics, instruments, anything that really talked about understanding how culture responsive curriculum could be. That included genres around, or fields, disciplines around like diversity, equity, inclusion, multicultural education, etc. So the tools we looked at might not have been expressly about culturally responsive education, but had closely aligned themes, basically. There were two big problems with a lot of what we found when we did this search. One is that it positioned educators and admin as the sole decision makers about how culture and people were represented. So we know from a lot of research and from people's stories in their own schools that we worked with, that sometimes schools really struggle with recruiting and maintaining staff of color, teachers of color, educators of color. Sometimes different schools are able to get them into the door, but there might be issues keeping them there, right? Some systemic issues and things of that nature. So it is especially important for us to think about who should be making the decisions about how culture is showing up and what kind of tool would allow for others to enter that discussion. So that's one big thing. And the second big thing is that most of the tools are really focused on representational politics, meaning how people are showing up in a really kind of superficial or symbolic way. So we basically came up with a solution by doing a literature search of how to translate culturally responsive education and operationalize it for this tool. So essentially, one of the reasons why so many people like this tool, in terms of what they tell me anyway, right, is that this actually operationalizes the statements on the scorecard, operationalize what it means to see culturally responsive education in practice. And people have found that to be quite useful. So there's 4 parts of this scorecard. The first is a character tally and an author tally. At the most basic level, it is just a counting of characters and people by race and ethnicity and by gender. Fun fact, CJ and EJ Rock used only this part of the scorecard to conduct a report and basically found that the vast majority of characters included in their analysis were white characters, and after white characters, it was then actual animal characters before some of the other groups shown on this screen. So previously I had, a couple snapshots of the actual scorecard itself, but I realized walking through the statements might take a little bit of time. So instead, I'm just going to give you the overview of the 3 remaining sections on the scorecard: representation, social justice, and teaching materials. So those are the 3 key components that people are thinking and talking about. The way that the scorecard is framed is that there's statements for each of these sections, and an evaluator is going to rate their response for each of those statements using the response items that I'm going to show you on the next slide. So this is an example of the teacher's materials scorecard, and you'll see at the very top we have the response items: very satisfied, satisfied, unclear, not satisfied, and the numerical values that go with them, and then some of the statements that people are responding to. So typically what it looks like is that people are reading the statements and then reading the samples of curriculum and then making a judgment on what they see based on these options. After people have scores, they then have an interpretation guide that ranges from culturally destructive to culturally responsive. Now, this common question that comes up in the scoring process, and just some context for findings, is that sometimes people think that the opposite of cultural responsiveness is not culturally responsive. And most people don't realize that the not culture responsive is not neutral. It's not a neutral stance. So it's not that, well, we might do culture responsive practices or we might have culture responsive curriculum, but if we don't, we're neutral. We're not privileging, prioritizing, centering anyone. That's not true, because most curriculum centers dominant cultures such as white students in the United States context. So I just want to be really clear about that. And that centering of white students and their stories and their contribution is destructive in the way that when students don't see themselves reflected in the curriculum, when they don't learn about themselves, when white students don't learn that other people have contributed to the world, to society, ideas, stories, history, right? It really kind of affirms the centering of themselves, right? And how everything supposedly revolves around them. So that lack of visibility has real impact. And there are many studies that talk about that as well, right? So there's harm created when curriculum is not culture responsive. Just wanted to be really clear about that. So in terms of using the scorecard, we call those scoring parties, which are mini curriculum evaluations. And so far, there have been literally thousands of them since the release. So we have an ELA version and also a STEAM version, and people have been using both. And sometimes people will reach out to us and tell us about their use of the scorecards. They might give us feedback, they might have critiques for us, etc. But one thing that everybody asks us all the time is, okay, but what about other people's curriculum? Like, is it just ours that looks like this? How are other people faring when they're looking at their curriculum? This was not only a question for scorecard users, but also the EJ Rock team, also other practitioners, schools, communities. Basically, everybody had this question. So that really led to this study of understanding some of the big curricula being used in the United States. The study is split into two pieces, the evaluation piece and the research piece. On the evaluation end, we have evaluators who received a sample of curriculum, used the scorecard to evaluate that curriculum, and to make determinations about how culture responsive or not that curriculum was. The research team documented those conversations and transcribed it and took the notes from those evaluation sessions to analyze the discussions that evaluators were having and that they used to justify their decisions about what was and was not culture responsive based on the scorecard. So who were our evaluators then who generated this data for analysis? They were young people, educators and practitioners, organizers, and parents. And if you want to know a little bit more about them, I included one of the charts from the report onto this slide so you can see a little bit about who they are, their ages, their ethnicities, and their location. All of these names are aliases, so it's nobody's real name. Now, a common question that comes up when we're talking about the evaluation team is how does such a diverse team coming from different roles who may or may not be degreed and have the expertise that comes with degrees, particular professional titles, etc. There's this, on one hand, exploring the ways that culture shows up in curriculum, and on the other hand, there's exploring how well ELA standards are met, right? When we're thinking about literacy skills and teaching specific skills that we want to come out of comprehension, or reading comprehension, etc. The scorecard, though, is exploring the ways that culture shows up in the curriculum. It doesn't explore those other aspects of curriculum. So when we ask ourselves, who is best suited to evaluate how culture shows up in curriculum? Is it only educators? And what happens in locations where educators are mostly white women and there's not a diverse pool of teachers and administrators at schools in different districts? Well, part of that commitment to participatory and collaborative methods basically means that we believe that all of these folks on the team have cultural expertise, and that also alleviates teachers from having to know everything about everyone in order to make decisions about how culture shows up, and because it's bringing those different levels of critical consciousness. There's also pedagogical expertise from the teachers and educators who are in the room, and also there's knowledge that comes out of lived experience, right? So those who are users and beneficiaries of curriculum, right? Those of us who've been through school, et cetera, can reflect on their experiences while in school, thinking about their curriculum and what that meant for them. So there's 3 curriculum companies that we looked at, and we looked at grades 1, 3, and 5. They're from 2023, 2020, and the other 2 are from 2022. So the way that we sampled is that we took 50 to 75 pages of stories, texts, assignments, and teachers' materials. And that led to a total of 9 samples being evaluated about over a 3-month period. So sometimes we get questions about the sampling and is the sampling adequate, et cetera. When you hold values that really position people beyond educators as having something worthy of contributing to making decisions about culture responsiveness and curriculum, you have to design a study that is conducive to your participants. So when we think about a larger sample that's more comprehensive, only certain people have the capacity to show up maybe for 3 or 4 weeks at a time from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. day in and day out doing evaluations, right? teachers are paid professionals, right? And oftentimes their participation in these types of projects are also compensated. But when you're inviting young people, parents, and community members, they can't take off of work for a 3-week period for an extended period of time in order to go through thousands and thousands of pages. So we use the sampling method, which is fairly typical in research, and a sample reflects the extent that cultural responsiveness is reflected in the entire curriculum. There's no way that you're going to see cultural responsiveness in like this one corner of the curriculum and nowhere else, right? If people are integrating it throughout the curriculum, it should come up in the sample. So once we had our samples together, the evaluation teams actually conducted their evaluation. And then we got all of the data and all the information that came out of those evaluations and began to make meaning from them, to understand them. And that's what led to this report. So I want to introduce the research team in case you haven't seen any of us before. Here we are, Flor, who's also with us, Parker, who's not. And I think it's important to understand through whose lens the story is being told, right? So we combed through the data looking for patterns and themes that came out of those transcripts of the evaluators' deliberations to basically explain how they came up with their scores. So I'm just going to share a few excerpts, and then I'm going to pass it to Flor so we can make sure we get to some good Q&A. But here's the first one that I think I really wanted to share because they reflected one of the big overarching sentiments that was happening. And that was, Beijing, if our point is to teach children vocabulary, we can pick lots of different ways to do it. There are lots of different stories from lots of different cultural traditions in America that could be used, but all of these stories are very basic, if not Eurocentric and white-centered. So really talking about this overwhelming presence of centering Eurocentric ideas and curriculum being white-centered. And even in cases where we're looking at stories that were about Black people, Indigenous people, people of color, Asian people, etc., sometimes those stories were told through the lens of a white narrator, right, who's kind of telling the story of their observations of people of color, basically. It also led us to begin to see this pattern about an ahistorical narrative or this kind of decontextualization of a lot of stories when it's kind of told through this omniscient narrator who's telling us what happened. Another excerpt I just want to show really quickly is from the report as well, and it's a passage talking about immigration. And Ne Plantera mentioned, I feel like there's more to the story that needs to be shared in context. If folks don't know the history behind why folks migrated from different areas of the world and the historic content of migration here as a whole, people could end up blaming the group as their problem versus the society or capitalism that pushed migration here. So this area, this sample was really talking about why immigration was happening, especially for European countries, right? For Europeans who were coming to the United States and what they were facing. But there was limited conversations about what the experience was like for immigrants from non-European countries, other than really talking about the reasons why Americans who were currently in the United States didn't want them there and with establishing policies to prevent them from coming there. Now, when we're talking about context, I think sometimes it can be challenging to understand what exactly that looks like, especially when all too often there's not examples of what it looks like when it really shows up. So I just want to show really quickly from the headlines. There was a report that came out from the New York Times, and it basically showed this kind of revision to curriculum so that it could remove context from the stories. And I think it really helps to talk about this because I'm going to guess almost everybody here has heard of Rosa Parks and understands to some extent the role that she's played in the civil rights movement. So on the left here, if you want to read through this with me, it says Rosa Parks showed courage. One day she rode the bus. She was told to move to a different seat because of the color of her skin. She did not. She did what she believed was right. So to some extent, they're talking about a significant moment with Rosa Parks. On the right is a revamped version of this where they remove conversation about her skin color. And this is how it reads instead. Rosa Parks showed courage. One day she rode the bus. She was told to move to a different seat. She did not. She did what she believed was right. So when students read the revised passage on the right that no longer address issues of race, the context of why Rosa Parks' story is even significant is removed. And students will not understand the significance of this story. Now, I just want to pause here and ask everyone, can you see how removing the context really changes the meaning behind who Rosa Parks is and what she contributed if you never knew who she was? So if you only saw this version on the right, what would be your impression? I just want to see how you all feel in the chat. I see a thumbs down from Rachel. Anybody else? The reaction will be, who cares about who Rosa Parks is? Can you elaborate a little bit? Or it doesn't make sense from Janet? Yeah. Yeah, so you definitely want enough context for people to care and understand what's happening. And from Katie, she says, if history is supposed to help us see patterns, this doesn't do that. Right? Because they removed the most important part, right, Faith? That's where I thought you were going. Students wouldn't understand the significance, exactly. So for evaluators, it was glaringly obvious when this context was missing, right? For some. And for other evaluators, sometimes they missed it, right? Because they didn't have the same level of cultural competence. So in these deliberations and talking about and hearing about what was actually missing from the story, other evaluators learned more and deepened their own critical consciousness as an unintended result, kind of participating in this evaluation. So imagine this happening at a much larger scale across cultures, right? Across groups, thinking about ableism, thinking about homophobia, thinking about all of those things when we're thinking about creating equity. All right, so I've got just a couple more data excerpts for us. And this one is really highlighting the descriptions that were afforded to white characters as stories are being told about them, right? And so this story is about George Washington, and in this passage that we have highlighted, we're looking at troops and the kind of this description of being freezing and hungry and, you know, being at the mountaintops and all of these other things. And even if you look at other sides of the passage, there's other descriptions as well. Another thing that came up in the report is the extent to which full experiences were allowed to be described within curriculum based on white characters compared to characters of color. So many evaluation teams were looking at how are white characters treated, how are they described, what language is used. And they were allowed to express this full range of expressions, emotions, etc., conditions of what was happening, while other stories did not share those conditions, did not share that context or that nuance. It was rather these things just happened, presented in a more matter-of-fact way. So that was another really interesting finding that came out of our analysis. And so this made us think a lot about tone and syntax. And if you've already seen the report, we've kind of split it up into a framework that addresses hostility through 4 ways. There's like egregious hostility, ambiguity as hostility, absence as hostility, and respectability as hostility. I had a couple slides that talked about each of these, but I removed them. So I just want to briefly touch on what this means. So for egregious hostility, those are the overt, outright, obvious issues of racism, misogyny, and ableism. And then for some folks, the ambiguity, the absence, and respectability, it's not as clear as why those things are in fact hostile. So I just wanted to touch base on one of the stories that came up. It was about voting that you saw in the report. And it kind of had the evaluators were commenting on the ways that it seemed that all stories about Black people in particular all led to this narrative about the ways that Black people resist or Black people's engagement with the freedom struggle, et cetera, and ways that don't ruffle feathers and that don't tell the whole story about Black culture, Black freedom struggles, et cetera, right? And really emphasize choice words like patience when it comes to voting and getting voting rights. And when we think about the actual civil rights movements, when we think about voter rights, et cetera, patience wasn't exactly the strategy used to get voting rights. So thinking about how these stories really inform students' view of the world. And then finally, When we compare these tones of hostility to what we would actually want to see, which is the dignifying tone and syntax, promoting positioning characters in ways that are really humanizing, right? That are nuanced, that promote empathy and things of that nature. You can find all of the findings in the report. I'm not going to go over them here so that we can have time to actually get into our Q&A panel. But I did want you to know that if you've not seen the findings, here's a brief snapshot of what they look like, and you can definitely check out the report to read more details about what that looks like. And finally, you're up to speed on things, so now we're on the same page to kind of help facilitate our conversation. If you want to hear more about what's going on with some projects related to the scorecard, or if you want to hear any kind of news or updates, please check out my email list. If you go to the website, www.trillcenter.org, there will be a prompt right on that front screen that will say, share your email if you want to join our newsletter. If you do request the slides, requesting slides does not put you on the email list. So if you actually want to get on the email list for notifications, you have to go to the website to do that. And with that being said, I'm very happy to pass it to Flor to continue her presentation.
We're going to start a little bit with the impact. So Dr. Peoples mentioned all of the research side of it and what was shared and what the participants of the research study had to say about the curriculum they evaluated. And so I wanted to jump in a little bit into the impact the report has had since it came out in October. And if we go to the next slide, I just want to situate it and contextualize it a bit. So as many of you know, or maybe I don't want to assume that, but maybe some of you know what the narrative around curriculum is in the country. So there have been a huge number of pieces of news going around about anti-CRT work, right? And there's this huge assumption that teachers, a big number of teachers, are actually teaching honest and accurate education. So the birth of the report was actually to see whether or not this was true and to challenge this narrative and to really find out what students were learning. And as Dr. Peoples mentioned, we found out the actual opposite. People think that students are learning about accurate and honest education. And so as you can see in what we've pulled out from these curriculum pieces, which are the most updated pieces of curriculum, is that they're not really getting the whole truth. This is a map of some laws and legislation that are happening at a local and state and federal space. So this is a tracker called CRT Forward. And this is brought by a UCLA team of lawyers that are tracking the number of laws and legislation that are happening around anti-CRT. So some of these bills have passed in some states, right, which are inhibiting teachers from teaching honest, accurate education. And so Dr. Peoples actually showed you one of those bills that are happening in Florida, which they've managed to get the curriculum companies to adjust the curriculum so that it doesn't teach all of these nuanced contextual pieces of information that students really need to know the whole accurate history. So I want to drop that link in the chat. Hopefully you can explore that. That is a tracker for each and every state, and you're able to access what exactly is happening in each state and whether or not those bills have been passed. So that's a little bit of contextualizing why this report has had such a far reach, is because we're challenging what the narrative is actually out there. If you go to the next slide, I'll explain how we've been doing that. So we've got all these pieces of information and what the participants said and how they found these three curricula that are the most widely used curricula across the country and how they're culturally destructive. So the report really works in partnership with community organizers on the ground. And one of our colleagues, Imade Borja, was pushing also op-eds. So we took the report, we said, all right, here's this report for all of these educators that might have interests. And then let's also piece it with the narrative power, right? Because we have this evidence, and when it's pieced together with what folks have to say about their personal experience, it's just even that more powerful. So I wanted to highlight three pieces that came out after the report came out. And this is Chalkbeat. One of the articles, the first one, is by an educator named Nikenge Robertson. And this was a piece on teaching with tenderness. And the second piece was a Huffington Post piece by a young freshman in Columbia University by the name of Jalen Adams, and she really spoke about her experiences in learning harmful curricula in school and the way teachers use that curricula to teach about slavery and how that was so impactful in her life and how that led her to activism. And then the third piece that came out in conjunction with the report was a Teen Vogue article that introduced Salma Perez, who had a beautiful story about her experience in education and how it was centered in Indigenous knowledge. So I wanted to highlight those pieces because they came after the report and they were inspired by the report as well. And they really teach you about the narrative power of what's really happening in the States. And here's what students have to say about it and people that have experienced harmful curricula and what teachers are doing about it. So I'll go to the next slide. So I want to talk about reach. So we've had all these articles come out, we've had the report come out. And then if we go to the next slide, I'll tell you how many times people have downloaded the report. So really amazing. We have, as Dr. Buples mentioned, 2 different scorecards, one that's addressing STEM in education and ELA, right? And so we have crunched the numbers and it turns out that more than 18,000 downloads have happened of these scorecards. So that's a huge number and more than 1,600 in the report itself. So yeah, that's fine. You can jump to the influence. This has created a huge influence and we didn't expect it. I don't know if Dr. Peoples expected it. She's a genius, so I'm sure she maybe expected it a bit, but it had a huge impact. It had a huge influence. And if we go to the next slide, I'll tell you what's happened there. So districts across the country were really downloading this report and saying, okay, we've got these contracts coming in. We need to see whether or not this curriculum is going to be useful. This one's going to be useful. And let's see if it's harmful or not harmful, because there has already been work happening in this, right? And so I don't know if anyone's been following the news, but New York City has had a huge haul with Eric Adams introducing this need to choose a curriculum across the district in New York City. And so they've chosen one of the curriculum companies that we actually did the research on, which is Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. And so this is a New York Times article that featured our research, and the piece is about whether or not the curriculum they've chosen is going to be useful for reading and literacy. And so they explain that a lot of organizers and teachers on the ground are actually saying, okay, well, this is harmful also. It has some issues with how representation shows up and whether or not diversity is included, right? And New York City being one of the most diverse cities in the country, it matters what we're going to choose because this is really going to be an example for the rest of the country. So when we go to the next slide, now what? So we've got this issue. We've got to choose a curriculum. We've got to put it into our district, and we're seeing that this is destructive, right? So I wanted to say, because a lot of times we've been getting questions, what's going to happen next? Now that we know this is an issue, like what kind of action can we take? If we go to the next slide, it's really that I wanted to basically say that this is just one piece of the puzzle, right? And when we take these scores and we figure out that these curriculum companies can be destructive, that we now have to take action. So we have this research, it's one piece we can use to mobilize. And then there are other pieces that come with it, like shifting the narrative, having and hearing people's stories on the ground, learning about community organizations that are campaigning for culturally responsive education and ethnic studies and all things aligned, right? If we go to the next slide, how do these people do it when they've decided we have an issue, we want to address it? Can we use the scorecard to do it? And let's say maybe they've used the scorecard and they've looked at their own curriculum in their schools. Well, paired with that is a huge number of things that happen afterwards, the now what question. So once districts have decided to look at their curriculum and they've assembled a team of educators and community members to look at those pieces and they find whatever they find, there's a huge number of actions that have to happen afterwards. And so I have a link here that I want to put in the chat that is really useful, because it really helps address this now what question, is really asking critical thinking questions amongst these peers and groups that you've assembled to do the work. Is what comes next? What happens if we've already got some destructive curriculum on the table? How can we work with it? And so there are a number of folks on the ground, Dr. Peoples included, that are putting together wonderful workshops that are going to help you address those questions. But I really encourage you to look at this toolkit so that you can utilize it, because it's got some great questions to ask yourselves on the next.
So we did ask people to submit questions along with their registration. And one of the questions that was the most commonly asked is, I think the question that a lot of folks are asking in New York City right now, which is, if you know you've got a tool coming to your school in the fall that scores poorly on the curriculum scorecard, what are your first steps as an educator in that situation? And of course, it's a two-part question. What are your first steps as a citizen and a human and potentially an activist in that situation?
Got it. So, Flor, go ahead.
Well, no, it's funny because I think you and I would both have probably different responses, but I'll go ahead and I'll shoot mine out. And then Dr. Peoples, you can take over from there. I'm sure you're going to add some beauty to it. I think for me personally, one of the pieces that in doing the research that was super impactful and that Dr. Peoples and I will continue to work on is this centering of participatory research, is really assembling a group of folks that are extremely diverse. As Dr. Peoples mentioned, a lot of times when educators get in a room, they're predominantly white women that are looking at the curriculum, and the curriculum companies themselves have admitted to this issue, right? So when you have the scorecard, a lot of times what happens is you might not actually know how things are showing up because you might have not experienced it yourself, which is why it's so important to have a diverse group of folks that are looking at the scorecard and using it so that they can pull from their own individual, unique lived experiences.
Yeah, I would agree. And I would actually piggyback. So I think my first recommendation would be in alignment with what you're sharing, Flor. And that is, one, if you found out that your curriculum was rated as culturally destructive through the report, it's still probably really worthwhile to actually do an evaluation within your own context, your own school community, yourselves. One of the unintended consequences that comes out of using these scorecards, working in participatory ways, is that it's kind of in a way like a professional learning for many people, usually educators, right? Learning and seeing how people are reacting to what they might see as devastating representation and realizing, oh, it really is that serious. I thought that this was something that could be easily dismissed. Maybe nobody cares. I mean, sure that people say that about Indigenous folks, but we kind of know it's not true. There's something about those actual interactions. There's something about the space of justifying based on what you've read and the evidence that you've tagged in your notes to support your decisions, and the exchange that happens that is really powerful and a huge moment of learning. So that's one thing, is that if you're learning from the report that the curriculum that you're using is destructive, still do an evaluation yourself. And you have to make sure it's a diverse group, like Flora is saying, because there was a group of folks somewhere in the United States who used the curriculum. Unfortunately, this group was entirely white women. They had aspired to include other groups, but there were a number of barriers that existed that, in my view, could just be removed, but existing barriers from allowing others to participate. This group of folks evaluated the same curriculum that we did with the same tool that we did and rated it much higher. And when they read the report, they requested a meeting for us and with us to let us know about this happening and saying, thank you for writing the report. We now see all the things that we did not see before. As Rachel was saying, the sensitivity of being able to pick up and capture on certain things. It can be hard if you really just haven't had experience and practice in conversations around those things, and then also being able to facilitate and have conversations around race, around culture, and how to engage in productive struggle, right? So in these conversations, there are going to be conflicting viewpoints. At almost no scoring party does everyone come and everyone has the exact same agreement about every single thing. However, the scores are the same typically, right? And so there might be various reasons, but people are scoring ultimately the same. So I would say, as an educator, it is still worthwhile to do an evaluation in your own community. Invite your people, invite educators. We talk a lot about white women and other educators, and there are a lot of educators who do have really strong backgrounds, right? And education equity and critical consciousness, right? And all of these things, right? But even if you do happen to have a strong background, it's still important for people from those other areas to be part of that, because you're sharing decision-making power. Like, it's necessary, right? The very nature and essence of what it means to be culturally responsive, like, it's critical. So I can't emphasize that enough. I think as a human being and as someone who might want to be advocating, there's a couple things. One, the EJ Rock team has toolkits on toolkits on toolkits, okay? Especially around people talking about culture responsive education and taking action. So definitely go to their website, definitely reach out to them. They offer some levels of technical assistance around organizing, especially and thinking about those things, and some presentations as well. And then I would say also get active in your own local area and spaces, right? Talk to other people. There's really power, I think, in just even having the conversation. Some people kind of check out because they think these things will never happen. It's so bizarre. We don't even really need to worry about that. But as we're seeing, that narrative is changing. People are realizing, oh, it's a legitimate threat to not talk about how responsive curriculum is, because we might be going in opposite directions, right? Where we're not allowed to even mention race and culture, which is it's terrible. It's not good. So I don't want to go on and on about this. And the last thing I'm going to say is be in community with me, be in community with EJ Rock, be in community with each other. I'm human like you, and I do consider it part of my work to understand educational equity. If you're thinking and wondering about how you can use data, how you can design things to understand things at your school, etc., this is your official invitation to be in community with me. I get on calls with people all the time just to chop it up and exchange ideas. So I just want to share that as well. It's so important to build community and continue having those conversations. So that's just my initial thoughts.
That's awesome. I really appreciate so much the invitation to be in community, because one of the things that I was surprised that you answered my email when I thought I'd have to send 3 or 4 and then also find other ways to stalk you online, because the sensitivity, the precision, the clarity, the brilliance really that went into the scorecard really makes it feel like people who are set apart must have done this. And yet, like, an entire human who's not only willing to participate and be in conversation, but who welcomes that, is on the other side, and not just one, but many. So I think it's important. The scorecard itself has more than one author, although we have Dr. Peoples here as a representative of that team. The team that did the evaluation is always more than one person, and it's more than one perspective, which is super important. I'm going to put this in the chat in case anybody also is thinking about things. I have a handful of other questions from registration that I want to be sure to ask from folks that submitted it there, and then we will open it up. So please go ahead and use that Q&A feature. If you stick it in the chat, I'm worried that it will get lost in the shuffle of chats. So go ahead. Yeah, right. So I think actually that would be a good thing for what Faith has put up there, would be a great thing to chat about also. So I'm going to come back to that. Definitely. So another question that came up, which actually came up a couple of different times, is how important is the makeup of the student population in a specific school if you are trying to evaluate the cultural responsiveness of the curriculum meant for that school?
So I'll start us off, and then Flor, if you want to add, you can add. I think it matters in 2 ways. The first is the actual design of who's invited to the evaluations. And so if you know that you live in a predominantly Black or predominantly white or predominantly any group represents your student population, it's going to require more work for you to include people who might not easily or readily sign up. You want to design the parameters to make it a collaborative space, and you just have to do that work. So it definitely matters. If you are already in a school that has a pretty diverse student population, you still at times have to guard against that, right? When we think about like who volunteers to participate in things, but especially if you're in predominant spaces, you have to do the work to make sure that you've designed a space for people to come in and that you are prepared to, again, engage in that productive struggle, that productive conflict, et cetera, that also comes from when maybe a vast majority of people are holding a particular worldview and lens that may not center, right, the humanizing of other groups. So depending on what that makeup looks like, you want to be very intentional about how you're designing your evaluation space, the team, et cetera. And it might require you to invite people in other ways to go above and beyond to make sure there's representation. I can't say enough how easily schools disregard, surprisingly, parents and young people, people with disabilities. Like, oh, we don't have any of that. Like, what? And people really, when you're talking even about culturally responsive education, people are really prepared to engage with that on the basis of race. But for whatever reason, when we start talking about gender, when we start talking about language, when we start talking about ability and disability, somehow that is just like a completely different story that sometimes needs a lot more support, right? Do not invite people to spaces without thinking about including support for those spaces, especially if those groups are marginalized, specifically in that predominant context. Like, it is your responsibility to design that space responsibly. So that's just one thing I would say. And then I think the other thing that's important to note is that culturally responsive education is not for students of color. It's for all of them. White students need culturally responsive education as well. They need to learn about groups beyond themselves. They need to learn about what does it mean to be a white person, right, in this society when there's this kind of history that maybe you've been exposed to, maybe you haven't, but now that you've had these other stories, how do you think about the kind of person that you want to be? How do you think about freedom? How do you think about liberation? How do you compare your thoughts about freedom and liberation? How do you combine that with your peers, right? Your society, your classmates. The one thing I can say across the board is that people who are really for culturally responsive education are for equity. And equity is usually not just about one group receiving equity. It's for everybody, which is why we have that intersectional definition of equity to include people with disabilities, so on and so forth. So thinking about how you see your role, how you walk through the world, there's a lot of growth, just like we were talking about with like having the sensitivity to even be able to see certain things in curriculum with or without the scorecard. That also translates to how you exist, how you be in the world, right? When we think about ways of knowing, ways of being, ways of doing. And I think that also translates to everything, how you are as a friend, a lover, a brother, sister, parent, college student, mechanic, across the board, like everybody. I can't say that enough. So I really do, I hate to try, to use the cliches and like, oh, it's for all students, because sometimes people really twist even that and they co-opt that all bit. But it truly is for both. There's much for white students to be thinking about, right, through a culturally responsive lens and learning about other people, as well as it's really for marginalized groups, Black people, Indigenous folks, Latinx people, Asian Americans, people with disabilities, immigrants, people who are multilingual learners. I'm trying to make sure that I name and hit a lot of them, because I think sometimes even saying marginalized groups in some ways desensitizes us to the very real people that we're talking about, and trying to do that more. So hopefully that answers your question. And then I don't know, Flor, if you want to add to that.
No, you touched on all the parts I could have touched on. I will maybe just go into an example of a community group that we've been working with in Vermont, which it's in the district that we've been working in was literally 98.6% white. And so in this district, this question of but our demographic, is really going to fit here? And it's like, yes, even more so, right? Because you have these students of color that are experiencing, and I hate the word microaggressions, but like racism, really out and out racism in the school day to day in walking through the hallways. And so this sensitivity, this cultural sensitivity is absolutely necessary because students are feeling like they don't have the safety to discuss some of these topics. That's the only thing I would touch on there.
And I just want to add, Flor, too, I want to say it out loud, that I think the very obvious point, too, is that a culturally responsive education can also help white people to combat racism and oppression. And so there are many people who are not for racism and oppression, but don't have the tools, the knowledge, the skills to adequately even navigate what that change could look like and what it means to partner meaningfully with other people who have those different experiences, thinking about white folks and centering what that journey looks like. So it's helpful for that reason too. And I just want to say that more explicitly, because I think it follows what you're saying perfectly, Flor.
I think that's so helpful because it really reminds me that many of us who went to school in the United States, I don't know about other places, it might be true there too, have never experienced completely equitable, culturally responsive education ourselves. We might not even know what it looks and sounds like. It actually might be beyond our current imagination unless we are in community with people who have a different view, a different perspective that is kind of giving us mirrors and prisms what we're looking into, sort of seeing, oh, this is what it could be. Like I didn't even imagine that it could be this way. And so it's one of those things where you don't know what you don't know. So you've got to invite people who know something different than you do. And especially if your teaching community itself has a lot of similarities, there's always variation. Even if you look similar, you're not similar. Like there's this like erasure of the idea that there is culture for white people. And yet we have to reach out to folks that have had a different experience and that have different dreams. I like really was moved when you were talking about the opportunity to share what liberation looks like for different people, because it really makes sort of the work of doing teaching and learning in public schools, people talk about it as if it's like, this is the infrastructure for democracy. And that's really nice to say. It doesn't always feel that way, and yet, being in community with people thinking about what are we teaching and how, and inviting other perspectives into that so that you can become sensitized to things that you never would have noticed before, to narratives that you didn't realize were need a counter to them. Really is doing that work and feels a lot more like it to me. When those moments have happened, it's felt a lot more like it to me. It also, I think, helps you recognize the things that you're taking for granted as good. A lot of what happens in education spaces is based on nostalgia, basically. I mean, like the fact that we still have proms is completely absurd to me. However, real fun for some people, and really just out of this sort of nostalgia for an old version of what used to happen. And I think particularly in English language arts settings, a lot of the texts that we use are because they're nostalgic for us. So the picture books that we remember from being read to, or the novels that we remember reading. And I was listening to part of a podcast the other week where an Indigenous scholar was talking about, please never use Island of the Blue Dolphins again. And like, I remember that we read it. I don't remember anything about it. And so it made me go back and find that book and find what she was talking about and try to figure out, because it never would have occurred to me to question that. I would have thought like, oh, we've been reading this one for years, so let's just keep on reading it. It was good for me, it'll be good for you. Which brings me to this question of all means all. And you touched on this a little bit, Dr. Peoples, already, but this is a rhetorical move that's been, I would love to say played out, but has been getting a lot of play, let's say, in the science of reading movement, in the movement to ban books, and also around these conversations about cultural responsiveness. There are two sides to the all means all, or what's good for one is good for all, and that we need to be doing things that are good for all children. There's double meanings in there. Would you talk a little bit about how you have observed this, how you've navigated it, and what you think of when you hear folks using all in equity work?
Should I start off first? Okay. What's most important here is, right, one thing we know about the English language is that we can all be using words and mean them in very different ways, right? Even if they're within the same context, etc. And I had just mentioned this, this for all thing. To me, I think my initial reaction is it depends on the context and what is the function of that statement, right? And I think sometimes what I hear as one of those functions is as a way to maybe gather buy-in from people who might be on the fence. It's like, well, but really this is for all students. We're not going to give any special treatment to certain students, because it may be in that, or the underlying assumption in that statement is that if it's not given for all, it should not happen for any, right? And that no one is deserving of what they need if everybody doesn't need it. So the very basis of cultural responsiveness is that you're responding to different contexts, different ways of understanding, knowing things, etc., right? And there's also different needs. We will never get to equity, right, when people have experienced curriculum in very different ways by trying to limit our actions to solutions that serve all without actually targeting the disparities, targeting the inequities, targeting those differences between the ways that different groups are treated. So how can we talk about maybe the treatment you were talking about, like, of Indigenous people, right? And like how little our curriculum even leans towards any kind of Indigenous epistemology, meaning ideas, right, that come from Indigenous people about how we come to understand and know the world. How can we specifically attend to that unless we come up with this whole explanation for how this is good for everybody? I mean, and it is good for everybody. If you don't know much about Indigenous worldviews, you should. It explains a lot. It helps navigate lots of different things, right? So that's just one thing that I think of immediately, is that, and that usually the function of that in trying to gain buy-in, I don't think is the most successful. In history, if we think about any kind of social action or movements, this idea of changing hearts and minds, but getting buy-in, etc., permission is important work for some people, as part of a larger strategy, but as the main strategy for getting buy-in, for moving forward with anything, it doesn't make sense, and it doesn't work out. You just have to move forward. If there are people who are not on board, what really matters, what's particular to your context, is those people who are not on board, how much power do they have, right, in your process? And then what are you willing to do to navigate that process, knowing where they sit, etc. For some people, it might be convincing, right? It might be using this idea about, oh, this is beneficial for everyone because that person values comfort, and not identifying differences and specifics that are related to different groups. And so because they value that, you might be, okay, this is for everybody, right? That makes sense as a strategy if that's your one gatekeeper that you've got to get through. But I fundamentally don't agree with it, because I really think it centers white folks' comfort and really everybody's commitment to the status quo. So when I say everybody, it's because I've also been talking a lot about white people, but I also mean Black, Indigenous, Latinx people, etc., who uphold the status quo, right, as well. So that's my initial impression. I don't think that it's a great strategy if you actually want to get where you're trying to go, because as soon as you enter and start that work, when it comes time to move beyond learning, implementation time, you're going to hit all those barriers anyway. So that's just some initial thoughts from me.
Thank you, Flor.
Yeah, I can add to that. Well, yeah, there's, like Dr. Peoples was mentioning, there's a lot of power in language, right? And as we saw in the report, language, syntax, tone, all of that makes a huge difference, right? And especially context matters. But I just wanted to highlight Heather McGee, who's an amazing writer and podcaster, and wrote a book recently that was called The Sum of Us. And she talks about this zero-sum game, right? If one group of people wins something or gets a little bit of equity or a little bit of slice of pie, then that's taken away from our slice of pie. And so she introduces this concept of the solidarity dividend, where the gains that are made when people across race and culture and social class come together, how we can win together. And so when I think about this for all piece, in that context, it's really powerful, because then it means when we come together, we can make a shift, right? And we're fighting ideologies, we're fighting forces and oppression that is really, really dark and heavy. And so the power of the people really is important in that way. That's just one thing I wanted to add, and I'll drop the link to the book as well. I love the podcast. I think it's amazing. Highly recommend.
Awesome. I am so in the market for a new podcast. So I'm just really thrilled that you said that. So I popped that in the chat already. It strikes me that like this is really about it's not about like getting more culture. It's culture into curriculum. It's really about like allowing humans to see more of their humanity in curriculum. And humans are varied. We're not all the same. So like if all is meant to erase difference and make us like one big blob of thing, then that doesn't really work. But if all is meant to encompass all, like the sort of totality instead of the unitariness, not universalizing things, but being interested in the universe of things, then I think we have a harder time forgetting that there's more to humans than their race, and also more to humans than their gender, and also more to humans than their ability, and also like that all of the facets of identity are around and are part of things. If we want teaching and learning to work for everybody, we have to teach and learn as if we all are human, all of us, not just some of us. And I think when we cut off a version of people's humanity, we're cutting off everybody's. So that really, I think, speaks to the example you gave of a really homogenous district in or group of people in Vermont still needing this work, because race isn't the only thing. Like they have that, if they have that in common, there are many other aspects of their identity that are not in common and that may be represented or not in positive or negative ways in the text that they're reading, which is really what they are thinking and talking about, at least for part of the day, and part of the afternoon too, in many cases. So that's awesome. I'm gonna go to the Q&A for a question from Fran. What's up, Fran? Fran writes, how do we counteract the spin and lies from hate groups like Moms for Liberty and politicians to start the conversations in our communities? It's a big question. A good question.
Leah, would you want to start first and then I can hop after?
Go ahead. And then I'll go after you. I feel like I've been dominating the first response.
No, well, I mean, this is a really big question, and it's funny because we're creating a one-pager on Moms for Liberty and doing a lot of tracking on the money and where the money comes from. But Rachel, can you just reframe the question again? Is how can we best approach fighting against these issues?
Hold on, I moved it to answered. Let me find it.
And I do have some thoughts too. So
how do we counteract?
It's
how do we counteract the spin and the lies in order to start conversations in our communities?
Yeah, that's a big question. So there's many approaches, I would say obviously, but maybe it's not obvious. The first thing I would say is that investigating the school board system, right? Because a lot of times these hate groups, I'm going to call it explicitly, are going into school board systems and they're actually electing school board candidates, which play a huge role in a number of things, one of them being curriculum as well. But that is the first thing I would suggest, and maybe I'm just speaking from where I'm working and projects I'm working on, but they have managed to actually elect more than 275 school board members, which is a powerful thing across the country. And they also have a huge number of chapters that are popping up. So my first answer and response would be school board, making sure school board members are aware of who their candidates are, and then tracking that system.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That was going to be one of the things that I spoke about. It's definitely, as Flor was saying, research the rules for getting on the school board, maybe talking to peers and other people about who might want to run. What does running look like? What do the responsibilities look like, right? And at the very least, showing up to the meetings, right? So they take minutes and they're responding to the public. You have a right to speak. These are public meetings for the most part. So actually showing up in those spaces as well to get on record your perspectives, because sometimes I think there can be this narrative that just runs. I've worked with a lot of schools, and while there might be a good portion of people who are a little bit on the fence about culture responsive education, as they usually don't know a lot about it, I have not come across many people that are just vehemently against culture responsive education. Like, I hate that. Responsive, no, And so sometimes it's like a narrative right now, right, that people are against diversity, equity, inclusion, and diversity training. Like, some of the most superficial types of trainings when it comes to like making a lot of changes, like just because one little word is mentioned, here or there. So it's kind of bizarre. So that's one thing. The second thing I'm going to recommend to you is, I mentioned it earlier, I'm going to go back to it, and it's community. So last year, from the 2022 to 2023 school year, we ran a CRE fellowship in which we trained people on culture responsive education across the United States and to be facilitators for the scorecard. And again, this was a very diverse group. It included young people becoming facilitators. It included parents, organizers, principals. We also had someone who was not a superintendent. I'm blanking on the word, but the equivalent to chancellor. It's on the tip of my tongue, but I can't think of the word in this moment. So it was like a really diverse group of people. And one of the key reflections that came up at the end of that year, especially because we had groups that were in Tennessee in the heart, receiving, all of this kind of targeted action from Moms for Liberty, right? Folks in South Carolina explicitly on the call. A big part of maintaining the energy to continue to do this work is being community, right? You have to find things that nourish this fight. This is a fight that might not last 30 days. 3 months, etc. Like thinking about making sure that we have policies that center educational equity as a good thing, likely is a very long fight. And so preparing for that and thinking about how you can sustain your own self within that, you definitely want community support, because I think understanding other people who are going through very similar things, the sharing of stories of like actual things happening on the ground. And I know I'm being like just a little bit vague because I don't have permission to share specific stories. It can be transformative just to even have people to talk to about it, who understand where you're coming from, understand those efforts, win or lose, but especially winning and especially losing. So I would say that's a really big piece as well. The other thing that I would say is also lean into the data. I guess as a researcher, I can't help it, right? Data tells stories. Research studies tell stories. I think the lens that you want to use, I mentioned this in my presentation, is like research with good design and research with bad design. So going back, research, just like any other institution, comes from a tradition, right, of Eurocentric ideas about research and about what it means to measure and understand any phenomenon in the world. If there's a big universal truth, right, or there are lots of truths depending on your perspective, etc. So find researchers who it's clear through their frameworks that they value humanity, and look at their findings and share those findings, share those citations. I think another huge issue is like just the way that people are miseducated and just like using inaccurate information, probably intentional, but I wouldn't know for sure, as a way to mislead the conversation. I think having that data, having those numbers are important. Here's how you get access to research if you're not already at a university, or if you're not sure. Go to publicly funded universities and colleges. They will have libraries and their computer library. So maybe not the laptop you bring in if you're bringing a laptop or your phone. Go to the actual computer in the library, and you should have access to all the journals, all the articles, and you can explore yourself. You can host reading groups, whatever it is that you need to do. So I would definitely say have data part of that. And then I would say organize, right? organized. There are people who talk about all kinds of strategies. And I would say look into the various effective campaigns. If we think about New York City Coalition for Educational Justice, again, shout out to them in New York City. They raised $22 million for culture responsive education. They made it so that everybody would receive training and funding. What did that look like? It looked like protests. It looked like writing letters. It looked like educating people on what culture responsive education was. And it looked like using that tool, the scorecard, as a tool for everyone to get understanding. There were folks who went to some scoring parties who've been with districts somewhere in New York forever and said that, oh, I love this curriculum. We've been using it for 15, 20 years, only to use a scorecard and have to sit with this like, I love this curriculum and it's only scoring badly because you're asking about culture. But if you remove that, it's really, really, really great. And then like watching kind of like the transformation that happens, that's like, can you have high quality curriculum if it only works for white students? Is it high quality? You start to see, some changes. So there is power in not telling people how to think about their curriculum, but giving them a tool to facilitate their own conversation with themselves, with their peers, etc., for them to come to their own conclusions about what they're seeing based on a set of criteria. So I also just want to state that big, to me, I think obvious next move is using tools like that, working collaboratively, etc.
Very cool. I love how you call it a scoring party. It's really, it's a really important flip. It's a really important reframe, because usually what people are like, oh yay, let's calibrate on a rubric for fun. Like might be my idea of fun actually, but that's not like what you think, what I'm going to do this Saturday in the park. That's not usually high on people's lists. And yet, it can be fun, and it can be kind of a party. It can be an opportunity to be in community with other people and form alliances that you might not have had before, which is really important when you're trying to do something in your community, like show up at a meeting, or get someone else to show up if you can't, or not show up by yourself in these school board settings.
And I just, before you go, I just also want to mention what Flor had shown in her presentation, also writing op-eds, right? Contributing to the larger conversations that are happening too. So just wanted to pull that one out before we moved on.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's like the op-eds can be a way to share yourself to the world. And there's some really beautiful things that happen there, and also some risk that happens there, like anytime that you share yourself with the world. And I'm responding to the comment that Flor just put in the chat. It reminds me of how there are things that we might think but would not say to other people's faces. And so doing this work with other people, looking at curriculum with other people, and actually looking at the same page, looking at the same picture, looking at the same phrase with them. Is this something that you want to say with this person in the room? And having that be a way that sensitizes you, along with watching their response, which you mentioned earlier, I think is so powerful, because it adds a human layer, but also because many of our emotional and physical responses are contagious. And so we actually get a chance to be empathetic and to build our empathy muscles just by being in the same space. And it could be on Zoom, how much we love that. But I don't know that it has to be about physical proximity, but something about the real-time interaction reinforces the humanity of people, and then asks us to think about curriculum not only as a tool for instruction, but as a mediator of interaction in classrooms. And if we think interaction is a medium for learning, we think that it doesn't happen because somebody attaches electrodes to the brain. We think it happens because of interaction in classrooms. Then those interactions have to be human, or else, basically, or else we get the world that we get. Yeah. Right on. So I have one more question that I'd love to be able to ask, but I also want to give a chance or ask if both of our presenters would share where we can follow you. I think we've got a lot of links here, and we will collect and post these as a single document for folks. But if you have events coming up that you would like to share with this group. If you have, I know we've got your website, and also the website of EJ Rock, which is just like, that's the coolest name. Like, I'm not really sure why you get to have the cool name, but like, you're already in New York City, which is pretty cool, but like now you have anyway, so that's awesome. But yeah, tell us where we can follow you in real time, and also just whenever we have the inclination, so that doesn't get cut off at the end.
Should we just drop it in the chat? I'll drop it in the chat unless you
Why
want
don't
to
you just drop it in the chat? Drop it in.
I'll just say a couple of things. I'll say, one, don't be shy. I'd say two, definitely, follow on social media, but I'm like still growing that muscle. So let me tell you right now, it's very much aspirational, but you can email me and give responses. And I have plans to begin a YouTube series to really kind of unpack some things as well. And so many of you may or may not know, but the ways that we talk about research sometimes are not too accessible. And so the goal is to bring that research related to education, equity, culture, responsiveness to YouTube in ways that are like really easy to engage with and are not too long. So that's one thing to note. When those things get released, they'll go through that newsletter. So if you are interested, I think right now that's the best way to get information. I will say in terms of upcoming events, there's always really incredible events that EJ Rock does. I'm always learning. There's a partnership I know with EJ Rock and HEAL, which I don't remember the acronym right now, but I do know they have events coming up. And if you join that network, you will get tapped into existing events that are specifically around like what that organizing looks like, what it looks like to actually be engaging culture responsiveness and healing, right? Thinking about racial healing and all that good stuff. I'll also mention that if you're interested in learning how to facilitate the scorecard so that you can facilitate in your local areas, there will be a training that's coming up in the fall. Again, we don't have exact dates for that. And it would be, the way that we promote it is the people who are on the listserv. So in that case, EJ Rocks listserv. So there's like a little email address if you want to join, or of course you can just reach out to, I believe it is nyc-ejrock@nyu.edu. We will definitely double check to make sure that we've given you the correct information. And then also in the fall, we are also going to be hosting a workshop on how to make modifications to make curriculum more culturally responsive. So definitely excited about this workshop. It's one of the questions that we get all the time is like, what can I do? The workshop is built for people who are moving individually. So you're not going to get information about how to move collectively as a district because that's highly contextual to so many things. But if you're an individual and you're in a classroom and you're like, I'm going to do this, whether you're doing it in some ways openly, right? Or you're just doing it, right? You're just doing it because you know it needs to be done. It can be overwhelming to think about how do I start? What do I do? What does this look like, etc. There's a workshop that we put together, Jacque and I, she's also a co-author on the scorecard, that basically gives lots of strategies and what that could look like, as well as an opportunity to be on the hot seat, we're calling it, to kind of share those changes and all kind of fun interactive things. So just know there are a few events that are coming up, and I think a big way to stay in touch with all of them is join the listeners.
Right on. That's so beautiful. The last question I wanted to ask was, how do you get good at using the scorecard? And so the opportunity you're talking about in the fall to be trained as a facilitator totally answers that question. And we will collect all of these links and links to the page where you can sign up for the couple of listservs that you've mentioned into a document. We are going to post this on YouTube as well. If you have colleagues that you'd like to share this with, please go ahead and do that. It'll be up in the next couple of days with a link in the show notes, as they say, to a PDF that has all of these links that people have been sharing. So thank you so much. Thank you so much to the presenters for being with us tonight. This is huge. It is so exciting to hear about this from people who know so much about it, who've been thinking about it so deeply and carefully for so long, and who have actually moved in the world to create something that is changing people. We are now just going to follow you forever, basically. So keep leading. We're with you. Folks, thank you for being here on a Thursday night. When there are other places you could be, you chose this one, and thank you for that. Glad to be with you and glad to be able to share these ideas. So thank you. And as you sign off, have a really good night.